Well, good morning, everybody. Wow, that actually worked. I'd like to call this meeting of the House Education Committee to order. Purpose of this meeting is to discuss and hear from the department and other stakeholders on the Future Ready PA Index and student outcomes. We'll be hearing from stakeholders and experts from around the Commonwealth. I'd ask members to please hold any questions until all participants have had an opportunity to present. I mean that by panel. For members, the testimony for today's meeting can be found in your email or by scanning the QR code found towards the entrance door. Remember, we made that announcement. We're not printing up 8 million pieces of paper that get recycled an hour later. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask all presenters, and please, all presenters, just surmise your testimony. We have it. We don't need you to read it to us. We can engage in conversation. This committee has always found that the dialogue is where we get the most amount of information. It's a way for us to flesh out what we're doing and instead of just being read to. So if you're willing to do that, we would appreciate it. Before I turn it over to Chair Gleim, who's helping us today with Chair Cutler being absent from this meeting, which he told me about. A couple things. I'd like to thank both my staff and Republican staff and testifiers for your flexibility. Of course, this hearing was supposed to be last week. We don't typically do two hearing and a voting meeting in the same week, but because of the weather, we had to move it, so I genuinely appreciate everybody's cooperation. Real quick, Chair Cutler and I last year were very much committed. Both of us agree very much that the work that we do here is supposed to result in student outcomes. And if we are going to be having real conversations about future investment, policy changes, things along those lines that we need, we really need a baseline every year of how we're doing and look at a year-to-year comparison. Certainly we understand that a life cycle of a traditional student in Pennsylvania is 13 years, K through 12, so year-to-year movement's not gonna be wild, but we should be able to get some trend lines and see kind of how we're doing. And so that's the ultimate purpose of this hearing, and so long as I'm chair of this committee, we'll do this hearing every year. So with that, and before we hear from our other members, Chair Gleim, if you have any comments, we're certainly welcome to have them.
Thank you, Chairman Schreier, and thank you to all the testifiers here today. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments, and I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have to follow. It is my desire, and I imagine it's the desire of all my colleagues here today, that our public education system educates our students so that they are prepared and future ready to enter our Commonwealth's workforce. I realize that money and funding of our public education system is an obvious factor in determining how we produce future-ready students. However, I do not believe that just putting money at a problem automatically fixes everything. We have increased funding by $3 billion since 2023 with marginal future-ready outcomes. I'm hoping today we'll hear some positive news about how we've increased those outcomes. And the money for public education comes from a real place. I always like to remind everybody that our Commonwealth citizens and are responsible for the money that actually comes through education. It's their tax dollars that we need to use wisely. Multi-million-dollar increases in funding for marginal improvements are not actually what our citizens are hopeful for. They're hopeful that we actually use that money wisely. I was reminded this weekend of one of our founding fathers, Thomas Paine, and his work called Common Sense. Thomas Paine was nonpartisan. He wrote that more simple anything is, the more simple anything is, the less likely it is to be disordered. And I would say that some of our funding formulas and the way that we do things here in the Commonwealth have become disordered. Government has a way of making something so cumbersome it can't be unraveled or fixed. And we keep putting Band-Aids on problems which sometimes make it worse. I contend that this is what is happening to our funding formula currently, as well as the PA Ready Index. Neither are working well, and no matter how much money we put through these formulas, we are getting the same results. So that's why I'm looking forward to other ideas as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't also say that we have a new federal tax credit program that could incentivize contributions to students in Pennsylvania, of all students, including public schools. I hope that our governor is considering opting in, and I think he is, actually, from what I'm hearing. And I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Chairman Schweier.
Thank you, ma'am. And before we turn it over to the first panel, we'll have members introduce themselves. Representative Isaacson, why don't we start with you?
Good morning and thank you. I'm Representative Mary Isaacson from the 175th District in Philadelphia County.
Representative Paul Friel, 26th District in Chester County.
State Representative John Schlegel, represent the 101st District in the heart of Lebanon County.
Brian Rosal, Westmoreland County.
Roman Kozak, Beaver County.
Napoleon Nelson, 154th in Montgomery County.
Jim Prokopiak, 140th District, Buck County.
Paul Takak, Center County.
Tara Probst, Eastern Monroe, Southern Pike, 189th District.
Thank you, everyone. I don't see anybody online, but if anybody pops on, I'll certainly let them know. With that, we're going to ask our first panel to join us, if you'd be so kind. Coming from the Department of Education is Ms. Amy Lena, who's the Deputy Secretary of Elementary and Secondary Education. And also from PDE is Mr. Brian Campbell, who's the Director of the Bureau of Curriculum. We thank you both for your service, and we thank you for being here today. And Ms. Lena, we'll kick it off with you.
All right. Thank you, Chair Dwyer and Chair Gleim today for having us today as an opportunity to speak with you. As mentioned, my name is Amy Lena. I am the Deputy Secretary for the Office for the Elementary and Secondary Education, and Brian Campbell, Director of Bureau of Curriculum, Assessment, and Instruction. My written testimony provides a detailed explanation of the Future Ready PA Index, what it measures, why it was designed the way it is, and how it supports transparency and accountability. I want to begin by briefly summarizing the core idea behind the index and a simple example to ground the discussion. At its core, the Future Ready PA Index is about telling the full story of how schools are serving students, not reducing that story to a single score or label. Standardized tests provide useful information, but they're one point in time snapshot. They do not capture everything that matters to families, educators, or communities, such as whether students are attending school regularly. And as you also have shown that with the new truancy enactment, graduating on time, making progress in learning English, or leaving school prepared for college, careers, or military service. That understanding shaped how Pennsylvania designed the Future Ready PA Index. Rather than ranking schools with a single number, a letter grade, or a star rating, Pennsylvania intentionally chose a profile or a dashboard approach. The index is publicly accessible and includes a search by location feature that allows families, educators, and policymakers to view and analyze all the schools within the county, supporting informed decision-making and targeted support. So if you have not gone to your county, I suggest looking at it, and you can easily see all the schools in your area. This represented a clear shift from our former school report card, which was frequently misunderstood and oversimplified. A single summative score can mask the strengths, obscure the challenges, and suggest comparisons that are not accurate or helpful. The index instead displays multiple indicators side by side. It treats accountability as a tool for continuous improvement and not as a punitive labeling system. This design also gave Pennsylvania the flexibility to maintain transparency and accountability during the pandemic, when many states' single score systems simply broke down. Because Pennsylvania does not rely on that single weighted formula, the Commonwealth was able to continue reporting meaningful information when certain data sets, such as the achievement scores, were unavailable during the non-testing time. Most importantly, the Future Ready PA Index reflects what we know matters for long-term student success: attendance, growth, graduation, English language progress, and career readiness alongside the academic achievement. It recognizes that there are multiple pathways to success, and our accountability system is designed to reflect that reality. So let me give you a quick example of why this matters. Imagine two schools. One school has a very high English language arts score, but a very low math score. Another school averages equally in English language arts and math. If we only had that single number, those schools could look identical, even though they have very different needs and strengths. The Future Ready PA Index avoids that problem. Instead of collapsing everything into the one score, it shows each indicator separately. So you can see what's actually happening and respond appropriately. Each indicator is displayed using a simple color and arrow system. The color shows how schools are performing relative to the state goals. If you see a blue in a certain indicator, you know that they have met or exceeded the long-term state goal set for 2033. Green means that they have met the benchmark, the interim yearly goal, and they're on track. Red means the school has not yet met either goal and may need additional support. There's also an arrow, which is super important to give you additional information. This shows the trend from year to year. Whether performance is improving, you're going to see the up arrow, staying the same, no arrow, or declining, that down arrow, compared to the prior year. So a school might have a green upward arrow in attendance, meaning attendance is improving from last year and they met the interim goal. Another school might be blue, but have a down arrow. That signals a very different conversation. Yes, they have met the 2033 goal, but they went down from last year. So that's a conversation the school can look at to ensure that they don't continue to go downward. A red indicator, especially with a downward arrow, helps identify where focused attention and support are most needed. The Future Ready PA Index doesn't ask a single question, is this a good school or a bad school? It asks the question, what does the data show about this school's performance for students, and what actions can it help improve? To quickly answer Chair Glime's questions, we did see some increases. We saw regular attendance going up, meaning students are coming to school and learning. So that is really great news. I want to brag about Pennsylvania and the career benchmarks. We actually asked Mr. Campbell to go ahead and share the benchmarks on middle school.
So in middle school, we are actually first in the country in career readiness in middle school, and in the top 10% all over. With that, Pennsylvania was actually the first state to establish a K-12 career readiness indicator, and we were the first state to establish a performance-based assessment. So that is not reliant on test scores, not solely reliant on test scores. Students offer evidence throughout their schooling that demonstrates that readiness beyond just test scores. So we're also, as you know, we were one of the few states, about 13, that have career education and work standards. Our standards are K-12 in Pennsylvania, and were just recently revised through the Board of Education. So we continue to lead in that space.
Additionally, another important factor is graduation rates have increased continually and surpassed the pre-pandemic levels. So we're very excited about that. So those individual indicators have shown us where we are really doing well and where we need to put our focus. So I'm open to any questions, and the rest of it is in the written testimony, along with screenshots if you wanted to see what the Future Ready PA Index looks like. Thank you for having us.
Great, thank you so much. I have questions from Representative Prokopiak and Schlegel in that order.
Good morning, thank you. So can you just give us, so what do you think the greatest strength is in the last year, and what is the greatest weakness in the last year between what's been done and what's going on?
Absolutely. Our greatest strengths were attendance, career readiness benchmarks, and the graduation rates. We also did go up in math, so that was another success. Our area of improvement will be English language arts, but we did notice that the schools that have adopted the tools, which are free, the classroom diagnostic tools and the Firefly benchmark tool, actually did see an average of 5% increase. So while English language arts was still an area of need that we want to focus on, we did see some increases when they did use the tools. So we are looking at helping schools determine, was it the actual test, or was it that the instruction didn't match the way they were tested? So we're looking into that.
The decreases in ELA, you're looking into what that is, like what is potential reasons for that?
Yep, I'm going to give it over to Mr. Campbell.
Yeah, so we're finding some interesting things about the ELA decreases. First off, it's confined mostly in 3 to 8, or actually some of our secondary scores have improved. Some of the statistics are interesting in that there was about a 4% increase in items that were completely skipped. There's about an 8% increase in items that we call non-scorable responses. And what that is the student actually took time and wrote an answer, but not on task. So we'll get the life story of Kobe Bryant or, Taylor Swift. We'll get a story about a student rode his motorcycle. Just didn't answer the question. Which gets us kind of thinking, and the other stat I'll give you, then I'll go to the conclusion. There's a statistic I'll give you is about 15 minutes overall average less was spent on the ELA PSSA this year per student than last year. And there was nothing changed about the design of the test that would lead me to expect that was the case. So all of that kind of leads in the direction of if a student takes the time to write and is off task, doesn't necessarily mean they can't write. It doesn't necessarily mean they can't express themselves. They don't have a creative thing to say. We need to start looking at, and it's why the governor is in conversation right now with the State Board of Education to look at the standards. I think we need to look at, is the instruction matching the test mechanism, the questions? The way students are taught every day in class, the way students engage with pieces of text every day in class, it may just be that the test is aging out a little bit in the way that we approach that. Long-form pieces of fiction and long-form written answers may not be the best way to approach some of the standards now.
When's the last time that the test was changed?
Well, significantly, the standards were adopted in 2012. So that would...
So it's been a while.
It's been a while. Yes, sir.
That's all I have, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I have, joining us is Representative Jill Cooper. She's online. Guest member, Nikki Rivera. I see Representative Rivera back there. And we have next Representative Schlegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I had the opportunity to look at one of our school districts, their index, and I came across a term which I thought was something new to me. Actually, there were two terms. One was the state target goal, and I think, Ms. Lena, you had mentioned the interim goal. Can you define the state target goal?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the goal set that all LEAs or local education agents and individual schools have to meet by 2033. So that's the goal. And then each year we've broken that into pieces, so to give them benchmarks. And that's what the green, so if you see green, they met that benchmark. So you can say, this is our end goal, so divide it by 10. You had 10 years to get there. There was a little break because of the pandemic. And these are the goals that you have to meet each year, because if you do, then you should meet the 2033 goal. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. So do I have this correct, that the state target goal is a futuristic goal? You mentioned 2033, and the interim goal kind of gives each school the feedback on how they're progressing towards reaching that goal.
That's correct. Absolutely correct.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Representative Takak and then Kozak.
Thank you, Chair. I was just curious, we often speak about these in aggregate, right? But you're looking at individual schools. I just wondered, can we slice and dice looking at different demographic slices? For example, rural schools versus urban or suburban. I'd really be interested in hearing what the results are there and sort of what you're looking at, because that would help us in terms of, doing some policy and planning and certainly helping out our individual districts as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so a lot of those searches you can actually do on the index too as well. That's all things we can break down. We break down on the index to there are 7 federally required racial ethnic subgroups, and then we also look at students with IEPs, which would be students with disability subgroup is what the federal government calls it. Students of low economic status, which is tied mostly to free lunch calculation. and we look at students who are non-native speakers of English. So we have all of those breakdowns. As far as trends, I mean, some of them are things you would think of, often schools with higher percentage of non-native speakers. That affects scores at times, although the last 2 years, Pennsylvania has increased in that category for the first time since we've measured this way. So there's some positive traction gained there. Often, socioeconomic status has an impact. The racial ethnicity subgroups, not as much variance as you would think, but there is some. But it is primarily the two factors. And then many schools, the students with disability category, you have to look at that carefully because there are students who will qualify through their IEP to take an adapted version of the test. But by federal law and the definition, that's only about 1 or 2% of the testers. That remains between 1 and 2%. And actually, Pennsylvania is the highest in the nation right now at that, because we've pushed back on backing that percentage down a little bit. However, the percentage of students with IEPs is about 17%. So that means about 15% of the students with an IEP are taking the unadapted version of the test, the regular education version of the test. So there we see some friction, obviously.
Can I specifically ask about rural? Like, you know, can you separate out? There's 48 counties in the Commonwealth that are classified as rural or even by district. So just curious how we can pull those out and aggregate them.
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to say that every rural school struggles on the indicators, but rural is often tied to SES. So those that are, especially the combination of rural and low SES, tend to be problem areas, yes.
The other thing I would urge you to do when you go onto the Future Ready, you can look by county. I love that location option because then you can look at your whole area pretty easily and within ease and finding the schools.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both.
Thank you, sir. Representative Kozak, and then Nelson and Probst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, both of you here for testifying today. Thank you for your service to our Commonwealth as well. I really appreciate it. So one of the frustrations I've had as a teacher in spending time in different teaching environments is categorizing students and schools as in a one-size-fits-all scenario. Now, I understand at the state level we need to figure out ways in order to measure progress and success. I totally understand that. Particularly with state testing, as a teacher, it drove me nuts every year dealing with that because the teaching to the test and the way the school organizes around that is very frustrating. I was a social studies teacher, so my subject didn't get much love in that world. So it's also something of concern that is for another conversation. You had mentioned as well that, you know, it's not about good schools or bad schools, but it is definitely something that in my area that it's used and viewed that way, whether it's not through media or through things that are shared online. It is viewed as a way to measure a school. And it's often used as a political football, dealing with school funding and things like that. So just a note about that. And I noticed in the areas that I was and talking with teachers that students or schools will sometimes push students in those areas to get a better score category-wise. And what I mean, like, as an example, would be something like graduating. It's like, how can we get kids to, we need a better number this year. Can we push through kids to graduation without much accountability other than trying to push kids through? And so that never-ending need to have an increasing score, I think, can sometimes falsify the way what the truth actually is to progress. So those are just some concerns that I noted as a teacher that I've never really had a chance to tell anybody, but I wanted to communicate that to you. So what are the protections against these sorts of measurements causing schools to limit their focus on strictly index requirements? And do you believe the index is providing a framework for a well-rounded education, particularly for the transformation happening in our economy of less kids going to college and more kids trying to enter the workforce earlier?
Let me say one thing first.
Yeah, so
Hold on one second. I just want to say one couple things. I am actually appreciative of you asking those and saying and speaking your mind. I also am appreciative of having all of you having us here because I think the more that we can be here and be in a public forum to talk about, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So it is really important. And one thing is, it's important to know that we're teaching to the standards, and so we need to have standards set across so that we can ensure all students are meeting a baseline. And I taught English, social studies, science, and math. So I was in my first 3 years of teaching, I was a tested subject in 3 out of the 4 areas that I taught, and at 8th grade level. And so I understand that, and I definitely, felt the pressure. And then I also taught social studies that was not tested. But I did realize as I've gone through my career that it's important that I teach the standards. We are talking to the state board to reopen the standards. We want to give them a refresh. We want to make sure that they're relevant to the students' learning. But we want to make sure that we're teaching the standards and giving every student that baseline. So that is also what was happening for so many years, is that single score, which did cause the state to create that comparison. I know because I was a principal during that time. I was very proud of my school because I had a really high score, and I was really proud. But that score did not tell me if I was struggling in the different areas. It just gave me a score to brag about, right? So I think what has happened, and I continue to see happening because we had that pandemic and we didn't have all the scores, that it's caused this breakdown where I'm still getting a lot of emails asking for that single score. So that's why we want to be here. We want to advertise. We want to look at the whole student, and we don't want to push kids just to graduate. We want to make sure that they are meeting the standards along the way so that they earn that graduation. I'm going to let Mr. Campbell talk more about it, but I wanted to point that out.
No, that's fantastic, and very much what I was going to say. I actually want to acknowledge your opening to that too, because I agree. A lot of people don't realize the old SPP, the school performance profile, that was not on a scale of 1 to 100. But every year when we released it, people signed letter grades or wrote it as a percentage or whatever. It wasn't even on a 1 to 100 scale. So I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about this and inform people so that hopefully we can inform the public how to read some of these things. I think that is important. You're right. These things can be misused. I mean, data is only as good as the information when you know those things. Also with graduation, I do really hope the pathways, to your point, have emphasized things beyond, now Keystones are only 2 of the 5 pathways. 3 of the 5 are career-based. I would also say how we are trying to mitigate that on the present index. While when you first log on, you see those 6 indicators up front. There are 6 federal indicators that are required for school improvement under ESSA. That is how we designate schools. It's proficiency, growth, attendance, graduation, English language attainment. It's proficient in math and English. That's how you get to 6. But there are 13 indicators on the Future Ready PA Index. So Pennsylvania voluntarily added 7 that we thought were important that we don't believe the federal government and ESSA took into account. They include the number of students that get certifications, that pass a NOCTI or NIMS in a CTE program, complete a CTE program. We can include the number of students who have gone to a 4-year college, who have enlisted in the military, who have a job in which they pay taxes, is basically the employment baseline. We have an indicator about students that take the APs, the IBs, the SATs, some of the other measures of success that aren't our own state tests. So I think I agree with you, and Amy's answer about the standards is the way to get at that concept of teaching to the test or pushing someone through. But I do think we are trying to message that, and hopefully we can continue to message better those things, because I do think they're there.
Thank you. And I just want to communicate that I really hope someday that we get some sort of measurement on history, because I think our students really need to understand our history in order to be good citizens. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We are also joined by Representatives Diorsi and Anderson, and online by Representative Curry. Up next, we have Representative Nelson and then Representative Probst.
Thank you, and I appreciate the Understanding Our History report. Help me understand a little bit more about, I'll call it grade level proficiency, because what's not excessively clear and what we don't yet publish on the website are like PVOS scores. We do publish Keystones and PSSA scores. When I look at PSSA scores, there are a couple things that are odd to me. One is just 5th and 6th grade ELA. It seems to be this kind of artificial skew towards proficiency, and it looks like it takes from below basic to basic. So I said towards proficiency, but towards basic. I assume you guys have seen that. It looked like it has historically been a one-year thing. Now it's 5th and 6th grade, or I guess maybe 6th and 7th grade skew. Is there something that we're doing to address that?
Yeah, so where we see historical kind of skewing typically is at the transitions in building levels. And that's why you see it at 5th and 6th. It occurs in 7th grade math very often because 7th grade is usually the dividing line for the number of students that start to take algebra early and those that don't in a less academic pathway. So what that tends to look like to us in the transition between, say, an elementary and a middle school, which usually happens in 5th or 6th grade, there, in addition to each year content, the rigor of the content increases, you now have things that happen in that transition where there might be a little less support for a student, for them to get used to in the first year. You've got this is the first time the kid will change teachers for each individual period. This is the first time the kid is mixed into classes with students who are older than they are in electives. It's the first time the kid, is bringing their own lunch, has a locker. There's a lot going on. We see those transition years in many indicators as little hiccups. I think that's where some of the supports that we've tried to add through counseling, school counselors, through making that more aware to our pre-service teachers, some of the things we've done with certification and breaking down those middle school certifications. I think that is where we may get to that.
Checking on, it just looks like when I look at the below basic numbers within ELA at that 6th and 7th grade levels, they look artificially low and then they climb again. And it looks like there's a shift from below basic to basic. It doesn't appear to say the same thing at proficient or advanced. Anyway, that's not the key to it. I asked that to say, how do you all look at what's being tested and ensuring that there's some level of real consistency that we can look at year over year?
Right.
Help me, my bigger question, and I always look at below basic, and I don't exactly understand how we get there. I understand it's like some level of PVAS deviations away from proficiency, the distance between basic and below basic. It's some level of, how many perhaps years it would take you to get to basic. It doesn't make any sense to me, and I'm trying to understand what I should interpret when I see 30% of our population at a below basic number.
So that, actually, PVAS is measuring something different. You're right about the PVAS calculations. That is about standard deviations away from the proficiency line. So that would be, through an algorithm, the expected. It's very much like when we divided up those little jumps into equal jumps. If you start missing those equal jumps, obviously the next one is exponentially larger, right? That's what PVAS is measuring. That's that standard deviation. That's the growth a student would need to make in a single year, which can get bigger each year, to get to where you need to go. So you're interpreting PVAS correctly. But that calculation isn't used in proficiency. That calculation is based off the proficiency. Proficiency is literally, it's like how you grade any test. The questions are weighted by the type of question they are, so obviously an essay question is a little more than a multiple choice question, and by the content, some of the depth of knowledge is a little higher. But the questions are weighted, and the proficiency is a simple math formula of there are 1,600, I'm going to use an example, 1,600 points on the test, and you got 1,428, that equals A. And there are ranges set for proficiency. So that is how proficiency is calculated. So the proficiency calculation is really more or less on a single day. Now, granted, it's a single day measure, but it's a single day of passing a test. PVAS is a projection of how hard you would have to work to do better.
So again, if 30% of the population is below basic and 35% is basic, how are we then, does that read to us that we are performing in a way that we're happy? Is that future ready at
Well,
this point, or is that something that suggests that
That's why we're addressing the ELA slip. I agree, those are large percentages.
the math is worse, right?
Yes.
So
Math did go up from where it was last year, but what we are also addressing, that's why it's important to look at those indicators, and it allows us to say, where are the students struggling, and is it a certain concept? And that's one of the reasons why the governor has called to say we need to open these standards, because is it the standards that the students are being taught because they've been around for so long, are they still relevant for these students? And that's going to be one of the indicators. I do want to talk to you about growth, why it's important for schools to have that indicator. It is an average of 3 years.
before we get there,
Yeah.
57% of African American students are below basic in math. We could talk about growth. I guess what I'm trying to understand is, how are we supposed to interpret this and have conversations around a future ready index when I'm just asking you guys to say that perhaps there are portions of our population that we're not preparing to be future ready yet? I personally believe this is certainly, as we started, why we need more funding and why we need to increase the level of urgency. But I'm asking us to say and acknowledge that 57% of African American students are below,
we
not
definitely-
basic.
We're not happy with that percentage.
Below basic.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, that shows that we need to be better, right?
Yeah.
We 100%
Absolutely.
agree with you. We need to be better.
Yep.
We want, and that's also, it shows us where we need to put our supports. So we need to put our supports there. I do want to say, one of the, we worry about, is the money working? One of the changes that all of you have helped to make is paying stipends for student teachers. And getting highly qualified teachers into every classroom is a huge concern. And I appreciate, and I wanted to thank all of you, because that is important to get, to see, that's going to make a difference in those students' lives.
Thank you, sir. Representative Probst, and then I'm going to turn it over to Representative Gleim and I for final comments for this panel. Ma'am?
It's good when you go last. Most of the questions are answered, so thank you. Thanks for
We
all
put you there for a reason, Tara. I'm sorry.
I was all the way over there. I just have two questions. So you said that the ELA the baseline really hasn't changed since 2012 or 13. Is that right?
correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I'm only asking that because but from when the time we went to school, or even my own son who is a freshman in college now, from 2012 to now with AI and these things, they don't write like they weren't even learning cursive for a while, right? So when we were growing up, I'm not going to give my age, but it had to be a book report. You had to pull out an encyclopedia. There was none of this. And I know it's the old days, and thank God for the internet, and it replaces, the Webster's dictionary, but it's just not part of the young people's culture today. So it doesn't surprise me that ELA is down. Everything is a 30-second clip. Everything is at your hands.
Absolutely.
And it's very concerning to me. So with the next baseline that you do, it's sort of like, do you have to take all of the new technology and everything
Yes.
into consideration? Because I think those numbers
Yes.
would change if
Absolutely.
you did, and I think they'd actually be better.
I do too.
Yeah,
And-
and we think that's why we're excited to open the standards.
And
Absolutely.
my second question is, this is public schools only, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. Did you break them down from cyber to
Yes.
brick and mortar?
We did.
And I say this only because I'm a mom. I have mom friends who literally did their kids' schoolwork for cyber. So I'm just wondering what those numbers came up to, because their kids were busy. Oh, I just did the report. I did this. So it's concerning, because if you don't really have that true in-school, in-person, face-to-face, watching them take a test or writing, it's concerning to me. So I just wanted to know if you had that separated out, or if they're all lumped together.
We do, and that's a good question. We do look at everything. I mean, obviously, every type of school is around because it meets different needs, right? And we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the Pennsylvania students. And one of the things, that's why we did break it down, and school districts are performing above, the brick and mortar traditional school district is performing above the state average in all areas. Brick and mortar charters are a little bit less, and the cybers are struggling, the 14 cybers. That's on the breakdown. So that, through our school improvement methods with targeted help, we do have those that are on those identified as CSI, the comprehensive, or ATSI, the targeted, we do give them some extra support, and we try to help so that those students have the quality and the information that they need. But yes, there is a difference.
Thank you, ma'am. Chair Gleim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to go back to that state target goal comment that we made by 2033. When I went into the PA Future Ready Index, most of those goals were in the 70s. Is that considered average? That we're just trying to get the 30% up to 70%, and that you're hoping that everybody will just be average by 2033?
So you want to talk about how it's?
Yeah, the way those goals were set, and they were set during the transition from No Child Left Behind to ESSA, is we took the difference in that baseline year. So and that was 2016. So I was an English Lit major, so I'm going to use round numbers just to help us all out. But pretend that in 2016 our English proficiency, our ELA statewide average was 60%, right? So the gap to close was 40. The formula under ESSA was to take half of that goal and close that gap in 10 years, to close half the gap in 10 years. So the half of 40 would be 20, you'd add that back in, the goal became 80. That was the formula that was used.
And that formula, excuse me, that formula is from the federal government.
Yeah, so there's only so much room to set those goals.
Okay, and then real quick follow-up. Are the additional funds and monies coming from the government to, the department, are you guys making sure that those 30%, to go off of what my colleague was saying, the lower scores, are you targeting those lower scores, or are you just doing kind of a full breadth of trying to get everybody up to average?
No, so it is definitely, great question. It's definitely targeted. So we have extra school improvement funds they're federal funds that we give to schools who are in the lowest 5%. Now remember, it's the lowest 5%. So even if everyone was at 95 to 100, we'd still have a lowest 5%. We're not there yet, but we'd always have a lowest 5% because that's what CSI is set at. And so those 5%, regardless of what they are, they get the most help and they get the fund. So they get a school improvement facilitator designated for their school, and they receive additional funds. Then we have the additional targeted support schools, and they receive a school improvement facilitator. So they're going to get that additional person to help them. And it's all through our network of the intermediate units. Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the next panel. I genuinely appreciate both of you for your testimony and your continued work. We've had these conversations at the State Board of Ed already, so I've been fortunate enough to get this data beforehand, but the indications are good, and I appreciate you both very much. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Our next panel is literally a panel onto herself. Dr. Sherry Smith is the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators. In case anybody doesn't know if we know exactly what we're doing, we do. Thank you, Sherry. How are you today? Delightful, thank you. Same rules apply. We're going to ask that you don't read your testimony because we're all capable of doing that, and just give us a summation, and then we'll open up the questions, ma'am. Thank you. Tommy, you okay? Don't die. Take your time, Tommy. It's okay. I won't tell you how many times we've done that in caucus. Don't worry about it. Friel left, so we'll just make fun of him. Don't worry about it. So anyway, Dr. Smith.
How about that? Is that better? I usually have a loud enough voice. Nobody needs to put me on a microphone. All right, sorry about that. The other transition we had this year that I just want to mention is that we moved to an online assessment for our students, and we always had that as an opportunity, but we're on the trajectory to go to online testing for all of our assessments for our students. And know that I even put some research in there to just prove to you that when you make those kind of transitions, it does have an impact on your results, particularly in the first year, because how you read, I don't know about you, I'm old, and so when I read something on the computer, it's, and write on the computer is very different than paper pencil. So imagine that for our 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and 10-year-olds as they're making that transition to online testing. It really improves after a few years of testing, but know that that may have been a little bit of the impact on the change in the ELA specific proficiency this last year. And then one of the questions that I wanted to answer was, does the state adequacy funding have an impact on student performance? Chair Gleim, I know that is very important to you. Is our money making a difference for what's happening to our students? I will remind everyone that we made that adequacy funding for the first time was actually last year. So we had a 5-6 month segue till we got to the assessment. So impacts, if you know, I used to love curriculum instruction. My favorite things to work on as an assistant superintendent, and I will tell you, it usually takes 2 to 3 years of implementing a new project or a program or supports before you see those changes. That being stated, is we did run a query on any of our schools that received at least $100,000 in adequacy funding in the 24-25 year and how their state assessments were. It did show that out of the 257 districts that did that, 79 districts did have improvement in math. 9 districts did have improvements in ELA. Again, that's the one where we're struggling. 82 districts improved metrics in at least one subject, and 6 of our districts showed improvements in both performance and growth in those areas. So what are the ongoing impacts for student performance? We heard them. There are a lot of things that impact student assessment results, such as continued truancy and absenteeism. Again, very much appreciate that that was a key target in the school code this past year. Increased early learning needs of our students, the shortages of certified teachers, student motivation on state assessments aren't there, and parent and guardian opt-outs have been pretty significant. I do add in here a bunch of what we should look future. I really appreciated in hearing from our state partners that look at the state assessments moving forward. I think the question we really have to ask ourselves is, are we measuring the right metrics with our students? We're working on creativity and innovation. We're working more on career readiness and workforce engagement for our economy here in Pennsylvania. And I think many times there has become a disconnect in our state assessments as they were developed in 2012 compared to where our trajectory, what we're doing. And I'll only use one example, and then I'll stop with my testimony so you can ask me questions. But you know, when we moved to structured literacy this past year and requirements, I think a really interesting thought for us to do is to set, instead of doing the 3rd grade PSSA, which is a whole different way of looking at questions and testing, we ought to look at that 3rd grade assessment results on our structured literacy. That's what you want to know anyways, is how our students are performing to that. So again, that connection between what our students are and how they're instructed in their classroom with their assessments, I think is a question that we really need to think about in the coming few years because we have really tried to transform, particularly again at the high school level, on how we're preparing our students for life after they walk across that stage in high school. So with that, I'm glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll start with Representative Kozak and then Prokopiak.
Yeah, mine's pretty quick here. You said that as an administrator, it would take around 2 to 3 years after implementing a program to make a real assessment of its actual effectiveness.
That's true.
Do you believe that that is wisdom that we as a legislature should adopt as well on changes we make as regards to the funding and the Future Ready Index and these things as well, that we shouldn't be constantly every year making more dramatic changes?
Absolutely. You know, I tell you, so when, let's say, we'll pick the structured literacy right now, okay? Because that one just passed. So I always like to use current examples. So, you know, right now our districts are gathering that haven't moved to it already. They're developing their curriculum. They're aligning the curriculum to what those are. They're looking at materials that they need to purchase it. Then they have to do professional development of our teachers and using that. When you change also a curriculum or an instructional technique with students, and you would know this as a teacher, it takes them some time to make that transformation. So let's say you taught a different way in second grade for reading. Now you put structural literacy into third grade. They call it an implementation dip. There's an implementation dip of how students' performance will be in that first year or two until they transform to that new teaching technique. So yeah, I think it's something for you to be aware of when you know you pass new legislation or new requirements on schools, that it does take time to put those things not only into place and start teaching that, but then students also have a transition many times in that change of technique.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Representative Prokopiak and then Anderson.
Thank you. If you were in our shoes, what would you be doing? What would your priority be for us to do over the next year?
That's a really great question. So one of the questions that we're really looking at right now is measurements for accountability of our schools. So it's a question I've heard when I worked for PDE. It's a question that I still work with our superintendents, and when I work with all of you, is we take a look at, you know, how do we measure success in our schools? And we struggle with that. And so, and do the measures that we have now truly measure that? So I was at the department when they did the Future Ready PA Index. I know how hard they worked to make sure that they had the correct measures, and it really was a big step forward in that work to look at other measures other than just the state assessment. But I think it's, my opinion is, I would want to reopen our ESSA plan. You know, Future Ready, I mean, federal government has made, USDOE has made lots of statements about the fact that they want to get out of the way more and states have more control over education. Well, some of those measures, to be honest with you, back when we did the Future Ready PA Index, we didn't like the way that it measured it. So it's not necessarily the measurements that were wrong, but it's the metrics behind how you had to measure it that sometimes didn't do that. So I think we should take a look at, are our state assessments still applicable for the way that we're teaching in our classrooms, whether it's the Keystones at the high school or it's the PSSA's 3rd through 8th grade, and the types of questions we're asking. You guys have brought some really great questions today, knowing that, you know, life has changed in the life of our students for, you know, the internet and the way we read short segments versus long novels and those types of things in schools. But our assessments haven't transitioned to that. The other thing is that I think our academic standards, I was really pleased to hear that, I think our academic standards are too broad. They're way too broad. And one of the things I would tell you is that when you teach, you have to have a target. And when you have all these types of things or skills and things that you need to teach in that classroom, and you're trying to meet those academic standards that are tested on there, we don't just have enough time with students. And so sometimes we don't do intensive, consistent teaching on that, but we have to fragment it because we have to make sure that we meet all those standards and all those things every year with every student. Is that best preparing them for life after high school? I question whether that's true anymore. And I think we really need to do a reset. And I think we need to do a reset on what are the requirements and what we should be teaching to our students on the broadness of the academic standards. And I think we also be looking at, do our assessments match what we're teaching in our schools to truly measure the successes that are happening in our schools?
And I'm imagining that discussion affects test scores.
It definitely does. It definitely does.
That's all I have, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you both. Representative Anderson and then Takak.
Well, thank you for being here. It's appreciated. First, I want to say, if Oh, I apologize.
There you go.
That it does take, I usually don't need a microphone, so but I guess it does help. You stated that it's pretty incredible that these changes, due to funding, changed marginally. If you look at the numbers over 6 months, I agree with you that it usually does take 2 to 3 years. So are you saying that the 6-month improvement is then directly related to the additional funding, even though we all know that it takes 2 to 3 years to see improvements?
You can't do a one-to-one correlation to that, no. I mean, there's a lot of mitigating factors that impact how students perform on their state assessment, sir. So, you know, that's the difficulty of all this, right? Is that there's so many factors that, you know, on how students test on a day or on a period of time, such as the time of day. I mean, there's just so many factors. I actually tried to do a dissertation on that, and they threw it out because you couldn't do enough of a one-to-one correlation between those things and how students perform in those assessments. So can I say there's a one-to-one correlation for the adequacy funding in 6 months to those test results? No way. I don't think anybody could do that.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Did you just say you started a second dissertation? You kind of
No,
did.
start of my dissertation.
Okay, all
I
right.
changed my subject.
Overachiever, whatever. So thank you, ma'am. Representative Takak?
Thank you, Chair. I will try not to start a dissertation here, but just a real quick reality check. We're a Commonwealth, and we value local control tremendously. There are 500 different school boards that are setting policy and interpreting policy and directing, you know, school administrators. And I don't have to tell you how polarized and partisan and often fraught a lot of the decision and just the environment that we're existing in right now. I'm curious, from your perspective as a school administrator, what can we as a legislature do to help build some bridges rather than continue to build up walls between those competing interest groups? Because, you know, look, at the end of the day, we all have a vested interest in this, right? We need to educate our kids. We need to build for the future. It's just the reality of where we are right now. And I'm just curious, given your experience, you know, what is it that we can or should be doing to try and help surmount some of those really significant challenges?
Yeah, that's a really good question, sir. And one that we manage with our school leaders across the Commonwealth all the time in discussions is it is polarizing right now in many of our school districts. But the one thing I will always tell you that I've learned, and actually I say this about all our legislators when I talk to our school leaders, is, you know, the one thing I know is we all care about our students. We all care about our kids. We may have different opinions, but we care about our students. So I think more than ever, what we're trying to do is really talk to our schools is that you're not on an island on your own, that you need to involve your community and your parents into the conversations, and it's how does the community benefit the school district and how does the school district benefit the community? Because to be honest with you, there's so many needs of our students these days, we can't do it in isolation. And it really needs to be a community, local effort to be able to do that. So I think one of the things you said, I think, is really important. I think you do need to look at and remember that in decisions that are made, that our communities are different. I say this all the time. If you know one district in Pennsylvania, you know one district in Pennsylvania. And certainly, you have to have certain metrics that you want all schools to be able to meet as a state, right? And we should be proud of our state and the work that we do. But I think there's a lot of things that we need to, in my mind, clear the pathway and refresh and reset so that we really are measuring the right things, that we are involving, allowing local impact on the decisions we're making, but allow them to show how are they measuring successes for their students, what's important to them as a community for each one of their schools in that. What we measure sometimes isn't important to our parents, which is really interesting. What are the metrics and things that are important to them? Interesting enough, we just had a group, sorry, Chair, I'm maybe going too far, but we just had a conversation with 3 of our other groups, PA principals, PASBO, PSBA, and ourselves, and we brought our members, our boards together, and we asked the question, what are the measures of accountability that matter to our communities about our school performance and our students? And so we just collected that information because that's something we want to help to inform and educate on. Here's the things that, across Pennsylvania that we think are important for you to look at as measures of success for our students. And again, I'll just say I think it's time for us to be able to look at that and do that, but I think in any decision, we need to remember that it's different depending on where you live. In Pennsylvania, we have some really different, big differences in the things that are important for our students, number one, and number two, in how they perform when you come up with one type of state assessment that is supposed to measure the successes of those students.
And just as a real quick, what you said is basically it's easier to make progress if you're starting from common ground versus from where we disagree. So I could
That's
not
correct, sir.
agree with you more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Representative Cooper and then Representative Gleim will start closing us out.
Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Smith. You mentioned about how there are federal statutes and regulations that actually limit what we can do here. My understanding is, under the Trump administration, the U.S. Department of Education has invited states to seek waivers to these burdensome regulations. I'm sure you're familiar with Iowa, that became the first state to actually apply for and receive a waiver so that they could focus federal dollars specifically how they wanted. Are you in the process, or is anybody in PASA looking at how to take advantage of this waiver, and what would be your first suggestion if you did?
Well, certainly, that would be something that our Department of Education would have to lead to as far as a waiver and or to reopen the ESSA plan to make those differences. I kind of felt that they were saying that a little bit here today. The question is, I think we first have to find out how open is USDOE for us to be able to look at that and waivers toward those requirements. But I can't believe, to be honest with you, that more and more states aren't going to start looking at that, because it's not just a Pennsylvania assumption or statement that sometimes our state assessments, as aligned to what ESSA wanted us to do, need an updating to our current practices in our schools.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Chair Gleim?
Hi, Sherry. I'm Dr. Smith. I was just wondering, you mentioned that you did that survey. Is there any way we can get access to that or just see what was returned to you on the survey for measurements and accountabilities and what every school district thinks is important to them as far as the work that you're doing?
Sure, we only did that about a week ago, and I'm compiling that information, but I'd be glad to share that. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, ma'am. Just, Dr. Smith, just a little bit of a question for you. You represent all superintendents across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and so much of since I became chair of this committee, so much of our attention and time and efforts have been creating the adequacy fund, putting parameters in place on how those dollars have been used, and now looking at, even though we really only have a couple months of data on the first tranche of adequacy dollars and all the other changes that we've made in the education code collectively in there. One of the questions that we do get often, at least I do in my community, is, are we confident that these dollars are being used appropriately? And whereas you and I have had 1,000 of these conversations, I certainly know my 3 local school districts that I represent, how they're using their dollars. I speak with their superintendents on a regular basis, and have a great deal of confidence in it. But from your perspective, for the 380 school districts that have received adequacy dollars, Is it fair to say that those dollars have been used to invest in teachers, curriculum, facilities, technology, those sorts of things?
Absolutely.
Have you run into any or seen any sort of hint of nobody's alleging impropriety here, so I don't want to say it that way. But more questionable decisions on how those dollars can be used?
No, it's been all great conversations on reducing class sizes, getting some additional reading specialists and those types of things in the district is really what we've heard in regards to that. And remember, you have the accountability on those dollars because you have them putting how they're using those dollars in the Ready to Learn grant process. So you have accountability. You can pull those reports anytime from P2E for them to tell you how they're spending those dollars in each one of the districts that receive those adequacy dollars. But never have I been a part of any conversation where, to be honest with you, and I'm honest, where I thought, ooh, is that where you're spending the dollars? I don't think that's where you should be doing it. I hear real credible, number one, appreciation for those dollars because they can start addressing where they see the lack of ability to take class sizes down. I mean, kindergartens of 30 students just isn't manageable, to be honest with you, and those types of things. So they're using the dollars, I think, to really reduce class sizes, again, redo curriculums and processes, and put specialists into place to help support our students in their learning.
And then switching topics or subjects just a little bit, thank you for that. I just want to drive home your point about how long it takes, a minimum of 2 to 3 years, some would argue more, to see long-term impacts on schools. And this is more of a statement. The lawsuit that, and we're going to be hearing from Dan Revik-Auksburg in a minute, the lawsuit that sort of triggered this started a decade ago, or well, at this point in time, 12 or 13 years ago. It took a decade for it to be adjudicated. During that time period, we saw 10 years of disinvestment or lack of investment, or inadequate investment perhaps, on 2/3 of our school districts that we had in the Commonwealth. So it's obviously going to take us some time to be able to ramp back up and just kind of get to that level set. But I think your point about the number of years it's going to take for us to see this. I mean, education doesn't happen in an hour. Those things that happen, we could come up with the greatest program here, but until it translates into our teachers being able to implement it, our students to be able to actually absorb the information in the way that that information is being taught, and for us to test it, there's a cycle there for it to take. And whereas all of us certainly want the results today, I certainly do too. I'd love to be able to flip a switch and have everybody at or above, more than 70% of our students at or above adequacy. We know it's going to take some time. And so that's why I think looking at the trend lines of where the data is at, at the same time feeling confidence that our school districts are using those dollars appropriately is an important piece of the puzzle as we continue to add to our adequacy fund. So I genuinely appreciate all you do. Again, I tell people this all the time on a personal level. When I didn't know anything about education policy, you're one of the first people I turned to, and I genuinely appreciate your effort on behalf of students across the Commonwealth. Thank you, ma'am.
That's my mission. Thank you very much.
Moving on to our third and final panel, we have 3 testifiers for this one. Again, the aforementioned attorney Dan Revik-Auksburg, who's the senior attorney for the Public Interest Law Center. I'm going to ignore Sherry tripping and put my glasses on so I could actually see that Dr. Brooks Bowden, who's the associate professor and director of the Graduate School of Education and the Center for Benefit Cost Studies of Education at UPenn. That is a lot of words, so thank you. And Mr. Aaron Riggleman, who's the manager of government affairs for the PA Chamber of Business and Industry. And I will say I appreciate you pinch hitting a week later, but frankly, we like you more, and you can certainly tell everyone I said that. So we appreciate that. Usual rules apply, folks. We have your testimony. We are, in fact, capable of reading. And if you will be so kind, and Dan, will start with you, but please give us a summation of the information. I will also mention you are a proud public school dad in the Philadelphia School District, and as a proud dad in the Allentown School District in an underfunded urban school, it's always great to see another fellow traveler with me. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chair Schweier and Chair Gleim. That is true. My number one job, and a parent of a child who school was shut for months because asbestos was discovered. So I don't think we're going to talk much about facilities, but needless to say, that is another big issue that this Commonwealth is facing. So along with my colleagues at the Public Interest Law Center and the Education Law Center, I had the pleasure of representing the school districts that brought and won the school funding lawsuit. And I think it's just worth remembering that what the court said it was setting out to do is to determine whether state officials were, quote, investing enough, particularly in the low-wealth school districts across the Commonwealth, and as a result, whether they were meeting their constitutional duties. And the court, after hearing 4 months of evidence, numerous witnesses, experts on both sides found the Commonwealth was not investing enough. The court said that in order to evaluate the system, we need to look at the inputs that are coming into the system. Funding, the court said first, and then also the things that funding is paying for. Right? Number one, sufficient, qualified, effective staff. Right? That's who's making the difference in these schools, along with safe and adequate facilities, modern technology, books, courses, curricula, things of that nature. The court then measured that standard against the 4 months of trial that it heard and found the system was unconstitutional, that we are lacking adequate resources in our low-wealth school districts, and as a result, we're not getting the outputs that we need, right? And the court spent a lot of time looking at that causal connection. One of the most studied things, and Dr. Bowden can talk about this more, but one of the most studied things in education and finance now is, does money matter? And witnesses from both sides of that trial said, yes, of course money matters. And it also is common sense because money, again, pays for the staff to do the things we need to do. And so the court found that insufficient funding leads to those unacceptable outcomes. The system is unconstitutional. It is not thorough and efficient. And this body got to work responding to that court's decision. In 2024, through SB 700, the law that created the adequacy formula, this body used Pennsylvania's standards, Pennsylvania's measurements to come up with an estimate of what all schools need to have the same level of opportunity as our successful school districts, and found the state to be underfunding its public schools by $4.8 billion. That is a big number. I frankly don't actually think it's high enough, but I think this body should be commended for taking on a problem that most of you did not actually create, but which you have the obligation to solve. And over the last 2 years, you have begun to fill the gap, right? So 2/9 of that gap has been filled. And I know we're here to talk about outcomes and how long things can take. But I just want to caution you that if your doctor prescribed you 9 courses of an antibiotic, after 2 courses, you wouldn't ask why you're not cured, right? And we are still a long way away. We still have an adequacy gap that, even not counting for inflation, is $3.8 billion large. So the job ahead is still large. Students are still sitting in unconstitutionally underfunded schools today. That said, the things that have been done with that money show where we actually can go when we get to the end of that journey. So for example, the Shenandoah Valley School District was one of the plaintiffs in our case. Schuylkill County, a small district in Schuylkill County. They have used the funding that they've received so far to hire ESL teachers and bilingual paraeducators. It's a district with a large growing EL population. This body is focused a lot on early literacy, so is Shenandoah Valley. And that's what they're using their funds to do, to get kids up to speed as quickly as possible. They also reinstituted art education, which had been cut. They've maintained some STEM education. That's what works, and that's what's required. Or the Wilkes-Barre Area School District. That district is surging academic interventions to its students. It has a middle school academic academy model, which it has now brought to one of its elementary schools too, where educators come into classrooms and serve both as instructional coaches for teachers and as interventionists for students. Right? They're trying to bring kids up to speed and do it as soon as possible. That's what works. That's what's required. There's the Panther Valley School District in Carbon County, another plaintiff in the case. They're using funding to increase both academic and emotional support for their students. Right? More hands-on science learning, things like that we know is necessary. That's what works, and that's what's required. And so as you're thinking about where we have come, where we have to go, how we measure success, it's important to know that two things can be true. Right? This body has spent a lot of time on education in the last couple of years. It is true. And also, we have a long way to go. Right? In practice, right, Shenandoah Valley still has all sorts of unmet needs for mental health supports, for academic interventions that they have not been able to implement. In Wilkes-Barre, just one elementary school has that academic model that I described. But Wilkes-Barre does not have one elementary school, they have 5. Right? In Panther Valley, the district not only doesn't have sufficient numbers of educators, they can't come close to meeting the salaries of their neighbors. And so the district that needs the most, that has the kids with the highest needs in the county, also has the least experienced educators and the highest turnover. Right? So I will not belabor this point, but just to say that we have made meaningful steps. And yet, the present reality for a child in the Commonwealth is that they are still in unconstitutionally underfunded schools, particularly for the school districts that brought and won this case. I'm happy to talk about this more, and I really thank you for your attention to such a critical issue.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Bowden?
Thank you, Chair Schweier, Chair Gleim, and others of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor. Yes, absolutely. I get nervous when it's really close. I'm also a loud talker. All right. Thank you for your introduction. Generally speaking, my work aims to support the allocation of public resources by examining the efficiency of educational investments and really with the goal of thinking about strengthening human capital. So my testimony today reflects our 2024 report on the economic benefits of adequacy funding in Pennsylvania. Many thanks to my co-authors, David Loeb, who's here with me, Katie Pullum. My testimony does not reflect the views of the University of Pennsylvania, and any errors are solely my own. As the Commonwealth continues to consider how to meet the 2023 ruling, existing evidence on the returns to education and the effects of adequacy funding can offer helpful insights that can guide our expectations as we think about funding outlays and as we think about outcomes over time. One bucket of evidence talks about the returns, okay? So the returns to increasing high school graduation and post-secondary attainment, they're enormously important, and they were a key aspect of our analyses. Conservatively, an additional high school graduate is worth about $500,000 to society. That functions basically through the increased income that those individuals experience, but then also increased tax contributions, reduced reliance on social safety net and welfare supports, reduced crime, and increased health. Importantly, research also shows that increasing school funding results in improved staffing, student achievement, educational attainment, and those then long-term economic outcomes that I just mentioned. So there's 2 key points in the evidence that I wanted to highlight for the committee. First, other states that made similar kinds of adequacy investments, they maximized gains when they fully phased in and sustained funding increases. Second, student gains accumulated over time, with the largest effects occurring for cohorts that began their schooling after reaching full funding levels. So in other words, like the best available evidence for us to work from suggests that a full phase-in of adequacy funds sustained over time is necessary to produce the student outcome improvements that the Commonwealth's plan aims to achieve. All right, so in our work, we coupled the evidence available with Pennsylvania data to examine the economic implications of increasing adequacy funding. In terms of school quality, we did find that the proposed adequacy investment in full could really substantially shift some of those aspects of schooling that Dan was mentioning as we think about teacher salaries and staffing for many of the underfunded districts to reach parity. In terms of student outcomes, we focused on students who are entering high school as the most likely to see gains in the short term. So this would be our 9th graders in 2024. We also focused on students who were entering kindergarten that year as well, as they would be the most likely to experience the full benefits because their educational quality would have been improved over all the years they were in the system. Importantly, the projected effects that we produced found that both groups had meaningful improvements. We then compared those returns to improving graduation rates to the proposed funding increase. Our results show that this investment is sound, with returns exceeding the costs with stronger gains as students experience more years of increased school quality. To close, Pennsylvania has made important investments toward addressing adequacy gaps. Continuing to invest in human capital through school funding allows the Commonwealth to realize both the educational and economic benefits that adequacy funding is designed to deliver. Thank you again for this opportunity to share this research with the committee. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bowden. And last but not least, Mr. Riggleman.
Good morning, Chairman Schweier, Acting Chairwoman Gleim, and Chairman Cutler, who I know couldn't be here today. Thank you for the opportunity to be here again this year. For those of you who were on the committee last year, my name is Aaron Riggleman, and I serve on the Government Affairs team for the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. We represent 12,000 employers across the Commonwealth in every county, every industry, and of every size. And our focus is straightforward. We want to ensure that Pennsylvania has a growing, competitive economy and remains an attractive place to invest, expand, and create jobs. With that in mind, I want to level set why the business community is testifying at an education hearing. And the answer is twofold. First, employers are among the largest contributors to education funding through state and local taxes, and they have a vested interest in ensuring those investments are effective and accountable. Secondly, and more importantly, we will all agree, today's students are tomorrow's workforce. The quality of our education system directly shapes the talent pipeline that employers rely on. And as Pennsylvania works to compete for new investment and emerging industries, the strength of our schools increasingly influence where businesses choose to locate and grow. So I'll start by saying the General Assembly has made historic investments in public education over the past decade. And Pennsylvania now ranks well above the national average in total per pupil spending. And despite that significant investment, student outcomes have remained largely flat or seen marginal improvements. And this gap between investment and outcomes underscores a critical reality. Funding is necessary, but funding alone is not sufficient to drive better results. To ensure resources are truly making a difference, accountability and transparency must remain central to our system. Tools such as standardized assessments and the Future Ready PA Index provide policymakers, educators, and parents with valuable insight into how students are performing across regions and over time. And while no single metric tells the full story, but taken together, these measures establish clear expectations, highlight best practices, and identify schools that may need or may be struggling. From a business community's perspective, we encourage policymakers to strengthen and not retreat from data-informed decision-making. But one critical element I hope lawmakers will prioritize is while strong academic proficiency in math and reading remain foundational, that's only a starting point. Employers increasingly, and the reality is, struggle to find graduates who can problem solve and communicate effectively and adapt to rapidly changing technologies. This is especially true as Pennsylvania competes for advanced manufacturing and AI-driven industries that require both technical skills and a highly adaptable workforce. These investments are highly mobile and tend to locate to states that offer reliable infrastructure and a pipeline of talented graduates prepared for complex technology-driven jobs. It's paramount that our education system includes and embeds employability skills into academic instruction and expand access to real-world learning opportunities like internships, apprenticeships, and youth employment programs. I'll conclude by saying ultimately, if Pennsylvania wants us to sustain economic growth and long-term job creation, education policy and workforce readiness must move in lockstep. Continued investment paired with clear accountability and a focus on outcomes will help ensure our education system is delivering value for students, employers, and taxpayers alike. From the business community's perspective, strong data and transparency are essential tools to guide improvement and support student success across the Commonwealth. On behalf of the PA Chamber and the broader business community, I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and thank you all. Up first is Representative Anderson.
So, as we heard from Dr. Smith, there are a lot of mitigating factors to student success. It's not tied directly to money, even though that's really all we talk about, is how much money that we are going to spend on education. Currently, the budget, our total budget, we just passed a budget that increases our structural deficit by $5 billion. Our education, pre-K to 12, is 36% of our overall budget. 36%. So a third. That leaves 2/3 for everything else. All of the other things that we want to fund and pay for. I'd love to create every school district and be like our top spending school district, but there's no money tree. I mean, it's got to come from somewhere. And we said, I think I heard 4.8 billion. We need 4.8 billion at minimum, and that I wish it could be more. With all of the things that taxpayers have to spend money on, we as a state, what percentage should it be? How much should we spend on public education? Give me a number, because all we ever do is talk about more money. How much is the adequate number?
So thanks for that question. I guess just to start, it is true that as a percentage, Pennsylvania spends a large portion of its budget on education, which is the same as every other state in this nation, because that's the single biggest thing that states do is fund public education. So whether you're an adequately funded state or an inadequately funded state, a large portion of that state's budget is going to public schools, because there's no cheap trick that can hire a teacher. You need to employ staff for children all across the state. The number, that $4.8 billion, that's from the state's own data. What that would do is it would allow each school to have essentially the equivalent opportunity, not to the most expensive schools. And in fact, this legislature's methodology for that law got rid of the high spending districts of the Commonwealth in that calculation. So I'm in Philadelphia. Lower Merion is the one we always talk about in Philadelphia because it's on our border. Lower Merion was excluded from that calculation. So it's not based on what Lower Merion's spending. In Allegheny County, Fox Chapel was excluded from that methodology, for example. So and none of the lowest spending districts were excluded. So when I say I think it's a conservative estimate, it's because we got rid of the high spenders to say, all right, we're not gonna try to get up to that level of spending. But so I don't know that this is all a formula. It's with in a state that's educating 1.7 million students. Precision is always going to be difficult. What the state did is it tried to come up with an estimate. And that estimate was that as of 2 years ago, not counting facilities, schools were underfunded by $4.8 billion. And in practice, what does it look like? In practice, it looks like when schools are adequately funded, that when a child walks into the Greater Johnstown School District, and that child needs a reading intervention, that child gets the reading intervention. Right? That when a child in Philadelphia is going to a school with asbestos in it, well, we get that child into a safe facility. So I think we can, in practical terms, we all know what an adequately funded school looks like, and we are still far behind.
I guess I still wonder about the total number. It is true. Most states' education is their biggest cost or one of theirs. We are currently number 7 in the United States in our education funding. Is it possible, and we sit, and I think it's great that we can point out examples from a few school districts where they are using money more wisely. I think that's a good thing. But have we done any studies and any research on school districts that are using money unwisely? Because there's two sides of that coin. And I'm just wondering if there's anything out there. I would give an example. We have in the state of Pennsylvania a 40% increase in administrators, 40%. Now, I would argue, and you could ask every teacher in the state of Pennsylvania in all 500 school districts, is that a wise use of money? And that research would come back very clear. So while teachers are struggling for things in their classrooms and have to spend their own money, and I understand that very much, or facilities, we're spending the 40% increase in principals and central office staff. So are we going to do, or is there anything out there, any audits, research, as to where we are spending that money, districts, unwisely, where they could put that money towards things that directly impact students?
If anybody wants to answer, I mean, I'm happy to do so. But
Sure. I mean, just generally, we should always be. I mean, you have someone here who is an expert in studying the effectiveness of educational interventions. I think we all want accountability because ultimately, because they're children, right? We all want our dollars spent wisely to educate those children. We do know where districts are spending the money. They're spending it according to the practices that this General Assembly identified, at least with respect to the adequacy funds. On administration, I don't know the 40% staff. I would tell you that what we showed at trial was that in general, low wealth districts have some of the lowest administrative costs, and in fact, maybe too low, when you're pinching every dollar, you're not always you're trying to keep the cuts out of the classroom, so you're making cuts to central office. But sometimes those central office staff are needed to make sure you're doing things effectively, right? To making sure you're putting into place good instruction. And so I trust that number, but I just say that wasn't the experience that we saw at trial.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Representatives Isaacson and then Cooper.
Good morning, and I apologize for having to step out, but being a member of the Basic Education Funding Commission, kind of have an idea of some of the testimony that was spoken about, why I was unfortunately had to step out for another meeting. And certainly I understand us, Philadelphia, the largest city in Pennsylvania, is also the 5th largest city in the entire country. And we are home to it. I'm lucky enough to represent a portion of it. And I understand that we need to make sure that we are spending the proper amount of money, not just in Philadelphia, but all across the Commonwealth, as we learned during our commission hearings, of the needs and to meet our constitutional obligation to fund public education here in Pennsylvania. Now, my question is for you, Mr. Rickleman. So you spoke about business and a workforce, and I appreciate that, especially with all the higher education universities that are in Philadelphia, and we don't want to have a brain drain. But also attracting business is also making the entire Commonwealth, wherever the business may want to go, to be a place that a business wants to invest in, to bring their corporate or their manufacturing or whichever the business is in here. And part of that is making Pennsylvania attractive to their employees so they can retain the workforce that they may relocate here. I think my question is the chamber understanding that, supportive of these increases that we are making? We are only 2 years in since the new formula. We are working on seeing the results. Results take time, but certainly the investments we as a Commonwealth are making into the school districts around the Commonwealth will make it more attractive for businesses and their employees to want to relocate here. And that what I would think is something that the chamber would want to make sure that we are continuing these investments so that you could expand your chamber.
Sure, and thank you to your question, and I certainly recognize and agree with the underlying point you're making about the importance of our workforce, and I think that's a recognition that our members have, and it doesn't just relate to the education system, it also relates to other barriers to employment that folks in the Commonwealth face, and I certainly don't intend to. I will let the budget cycle play out on what dollar figure is ultimately decided upon. I think the point that I would underscore is a couple of things. First, we know, and we don't need 2 years of adequacy, we know that the correlation between funding and test scores or academic accomplishments is closer to a scatter plot than it is a line. That is a long-established understanding that policymakers have had access to that data long before we had the basic ed adequacy investment. And I think we've heard today, and I'm proud to share in the praise of the increased test scores or points within the Future Ready Index that we've seen over the last several years, but that's admittedly marginal. And we've seen historic investments in education and yet a marginal increase in test scores. And so when we look at proportionally, are these investments leading to student success at a rate that justifies that cost? I think that is the question that I hope policymakers sort of consider. But I do agree, and I think the business community wants to invest, and we do invest heavily into our education system, both through taxpayer taxes and also providing on-the-job training and upskilling and reskilling or tuition reimbursement and things like that. So we want to be partners in that mission, and I think we may not always agree on how to best do that, but I just would hope that lawmakers consider that broader picture. But thank you for your question.
And I understand what you're saying, but I would also like to point out that these investments that we're making through this funding formula is not just so that we can hit benchmarks of a test.
Fair.
It has to deal with the school districts that we are educating our children in, the facilities that they go to school in, and certainly making those investments and improving them is something that makes it more attractive for businesses to look at Pennsylvania as some place that they would want to invest in.
Yeah.
So I thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
Chair, may I add just quickly? So
Yes,
there's been
please.
a couple different comments about the evidence base and understanding the role for funding in schools and the outcomes. Yes, historically, a lot of the evidence base was very correlational, was like very scatterplot focused, right? And there was a lot of debate. In recent years, though, there's been a lot of development in what we can do with data and in the comparisons that we can make. And while we're not able to have experiments to understand school funding at the state level, we are able to use the data to have causal estimates. So I feel very firmly that the evidence does point to showing that increasing funding does have effects on students, and not in like this like very correlational way. Like I think that we can point to that like with causal certainty. I think that the field has reached that point. I also want to go back and highlight what Dan said about at the court case. Different testimony from both sides were pointing to this as being the case. And some of those folks are people who were part of that like earlier evidence base with that more correlational work where there was more of a debate about does school funding matter. So we as a field are 100% past that. Like I think as a field we know that funding matters. So I just wanted to make sure that like there was a little bit of conversation there, a little bit of clarity around some of the testimony that you've heard today, that I do think that we're sort of past that point.
And if I may offer a point of clarification, the point of my remarks is to not say that funding is not important or a part of the conversation. I think I made that clear in my testimony. And I don't mean to, you're not making that point, but I want to make it clear to everybody. I think it gets to that point of, is there a point of diminishing returns where it becomes like a scatter plot? And I think that is the part of the conversation that I hope is not lost in the broader conversation about school funding.
Well, that's a great point, and I think it goes back to your question, Representative Anderson, around like how much is too much or how much is enough, right? And so based on our work, we were looking at the $5.1 billion proposal that was on the table at the time of our 2024 report. And as you can see in the report, which is attached, at every point, like when we think about the students entering ninth grade in 2024, all the way through the students entering kindergarten, we see positive returns to that 5.1. So I would say we feel pretty good about the 4.8 leading to returns, positive returns, and certainly growing returns over time. I would say I feel more certain about that than a scatter plot, but I hear what you're saying. And I think like if we were beyond some of those numbers, then I think like absolutely, like let's dig in and look at that and try to generate evidence around these really important questions. But we're talking about adequacy investments in ways that I think that the evidence base totally supports at this stage.
Thank you. Representative Cooper?
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Bowman, I had a question for you based on your research. As you know, we continue to lose population here in Pennsylvania and export a lot of our students. We've passed legislation to try to incentivize them to stay. Does your research include a decrease in population, and if so, what number did you use?
That's an excellent question. We did account for that. I don't have my computer right in front of me, and so it's hard for me to give you specifics. I also feel like if we got too much in the weeds, it might prevent you from lunch. But we do have an appendix. I'm more than happy to follow up with you afterwards if that would be beneficial.
That's fine. I just was curious if it was in the
yeah.
data because, you know, we are losing some in how that impacted it. So thank you.
Absolutely.
I
That's a great
appreciate your
question.
answer.
Thank you, ma'am. Representative Takek, and then we'll close out with Representative Gleim and myself. Sorry, Chair Gleim and myself.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is mainly for Mr. Riggleman, but I'd be curious to hear from some other folks here. I mean, you've already mentioned that, you know, our businesses are consumers, essentially, of the product of our educational system. Over and over and over again, almost every conversation I have with local business owners is about the quality of the workforce and the people who are available. You know, that's absolutely critical for the success of their businesses and our economy as a whole. They also understand a couple of things that I think can be missing from this conversation. One is that in order to make money and be successful, you have to invest, right? And then those investments have to have some return on that investment, the ROI of that. And, you know, we're sort of skirting around that, but just framing it in a business perspective. You know, the reality is that right now, our funding system is largely reliant on local taxes to a degree that really punishes already struggling communities and already struggling local economies. So it would seem to me that, I'll go back to my other question about, you know, that we're a commonwealth, 500 school districts. Can you comment on the role that your individual members, your individual county chambers are playing in terms of engaging with our school districts to address not only the urgency but the importance of this? What are some good examples from your members that are partnering with school districts? Because frankly, there's a real disconnect when I hear what the business community is saying and what the local education community and school boards are saying. So if you can help me, and how the second part of that is how can we help you in that regard as well?
Sure. I'll attempt to answer your question. If I don't hit on what you're trying to get at, please stop me and I'll get to the point. But I think it's a couple of things. I touched on in my testimony sort of opportunities within the educational system to integrate some of these things. And of course, some of it comes through curriculum like play-based curriculum and things like that. But some of it is exposing students early on to career opportunities. You know, I'll share a perspective that I had that I think maybe many of us share is when I started at the chamber, I had this disillusion that when you go to a manufacturing floor, that it is dirty, it is filled with, but when you actually go and visit these places, they're some of the cleanest places you've ever been. And I think that there's this misconception coming from our educational system that that is what it looked like, right? And so I think that stigma being broken, and I think that lands at the feet of both the educational system and employers to have those conversations. Another thing that I learned on a personal level when I started at the chamber is it's often the case that employers and educational institutions are saying the same thing, but they're speaking two different languages. And so how do we as local chambers, as state chambers, as policymakers help translate that language, if you will? So getting to your point, I think it's multifaceted. It's embedding those opportunities into curriculum. I think it's site visits and job shadowing. And I will take an opportunity to highlight the opportunity that AI has maybe to bridge that divide as well. There's some innovative employers right now using virtual reality. Instead of taking students from campus and taking time away from class to go visit employers, they're actually using artificial intelligence and virtual reality to expose students to those opportunities. So, I mean, we could talk about this for hours, and I certainly open and welcome the opportunity to have broader conversations.
And I appreciate that. I think we do need to continue this dialogue because sometimes I feel like there's a bit too much of an adversarial relationship where there should not be. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. We need to build the bridges, not the walls. And, you know, we all have the same goal in the end. So I look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And Chair Gleim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'm hearing a little bit today is about adequacy investments means increased in funding. And back in 2023, we heard 4.8 billion, basically, is what around that figure is what we were going to need for this adequacy, identified adequacy gap. Since 2023, though, we have increased education funding by $3 billion. So, but I'm understanding your testimony is saying that you need an additional 3.8 on top of the 3 that has already been spent. And do you have a suggestion of where in the Commonwealth's budget the money is going to come from?
So just to start, it was 2024 when this body, July of 2024, this body passed the adequacy formula, which calculated to be $4.8 billion. I'm not sure how much it has increased in that time, but just in basic education funding alone, inflation each year requires $300 million, just there. So 2 years of inflation alone is $600 million. Inflation for pensions, inflation for all these other line items, it starts to get eaten up pretty quickly. That's the first. Second, I mean this in the most respectful way possible, but determining where the money comes from is not my job, and it's not the job of my clients, not those school districts. It's the constitutional obligation of this body, right? So that it is not the obligation of school kids to say where they're paying for the reading specialist. I recognize those are tough choices that you all have to make. I don't begrudge you that. You have a lot of, the Supreme Court noted this when this case was before them in 2017, which is like, we don't take lightly the job of this General Assembly to balance all of these things, right? From public transportation to medical assistance to economic development to public education. But some things are constitutionally required, right? Education comes first. And so I can't give you the magic way that you should fund education or anything else in the budget long term, but what I can say is that under the Constitution, that has to be provided for before nearly everything else.
Okay, and then I just want to follow up on my colleague's point with the chamber and taxes. There eventually is a point of diminishing returns. I mean, if you're in, economics, you've learned the Laffer curve, okay, where you continue to tax and tax a public until the point where, you have diminishing returns on that. I am just going to caution everybody here because 50 to 51% of the taxes do come from local, taxpayers. And if you don't have a goal, if you can't give in a hearing that we need such and such more money and we're going to sustain this over so much time, it really is very difficult for the taxpayer to keep hearing this, especially when we are already number 7 in the nation in our cost per student. And I get Philadelphia is one of the bigger, cities in the nation. However, Philadelphia does have their own line item in our budget for education. I agree that we need to make sure that our schools are funded properly. But I'm just saying there needs to be a plan. And we do not have one right now. And all we're getting told is that we need an adequacy investment and it needs to be sustained. And we don't know how much it's going to be. And so I look forward to hearing, how we're going to get to the point where we have education funded.
And just to be clear, there is actually, again, this body did enact a law which gave a precise number 2 years ago, which is $4.8 billion. So you do have a precise number. The implied plan is that, I suppose, in another 7 years, you will fill that hole. I think that's far too slow, and I think the number is too small, but you do have a plan, and at the bare minimum, it's incumbent, I think, upon this Commonwealth to implement it on a faster timeline than we are on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. A question, and then I'll wrap up. Dr. Bowden, when you were going through, your research certainly speaks for itself. One of the things that you talk about in your testimony is teacher ratio, teacher salaries, and as a stated goal and need that that this legislative body should be focusing our attention on those things. Is that, listen, who doesn't root for their teachers at home? That's not just for the sake of adding more teachers. That is directly related, I'm assuming, to a particular education outcome that we're looking for. Can you expound on that a little bit, please?
Absolutely. So one of the pieces to the case, and then some reports that have come out after, like not just from my center, but also from like Research for Action and other organizations, have demonstrated some of the adequacy gap across these different districts could be quantified by looking at things like teacher pay, numbers of teachers per students, thinking about the numbers of counselors and other really critical staff that we know from an education policy and from an economics of education perspective, we know that those are like key inputs to driving student outcomes. And so in terms of thinking about teacher pay, right, some of what's been discussed here today has been around teacher quality and retaining, maintaining, recruiting teachers, which continues to be a major challenge for different districts across the Commonwealth. So one of the ways that the adequacy funding, we felt that it was an important way to explore the adequacy funding that was proposed was to think about it in terms of these particular resources and what could it do toward addressing the lack of parity across these districts for those resources. And it didn't get all of the districts. It was not like a 100% fix, so maybe that speaks to the question about the numbers. Like if that was the goal, then maybe the goal would be how do we have districts equally funded to have better parity across teacher salaries, right? But given the current number, which was 5.1, the work that we built upon, but with 4.8, it would be slightly smaller. We saw, remember, it was like maybe 40 to 50% of the districts could then reach pay parity on teachers, and then many more districts could then reach parity in terms of the number of teachers that they have. Implicit in that too, though, is thinking about the teacher pipeline and making sure that we have training opportunities and quality teachers coming in through that pipeline. I'm also a public school parent, and I know from my children's experience that there aren't just like highly qualified teachers waiting in the wings, and so that's absolutely something that we need to be thinking about too.
Thank you. One last follow-up, and then I'll start to close. Have you reviewed the regulations around the Ready to Learn block grant, which is the line item where our adequacy funding is?
I have not.
That's cool. At some point in time, I'd like you to take a look at it, because one of the things that when we designed this the adequacy funds, and we built on existing law, and which was always a very bipartisan part of the budget. We specifically enumerated things that school districts were allowed to use their adequacy dollars for. I'm interested to see if we've largely hit the mark on what those are, and what we could look to expand or take away from if need be, because we want to make sure that those dollars are actually going towards strategies and school district policies that will have a direct, or that we are confident should lead to a better outcome for all of our students. So if in your travels, if you're bored, if you could just give us a hint on how we're doing and what we could be doing better there. So
I really appreciate that question. I wrote this in my notes earlier with the prior testimony as I was thinking about, well, what were the tenets or the regulations around those block grants that went out? So I would love to look at that. I did get some data on what funding has been allocated toward thus far, but it's hard to interpret that, right? Like without the other.
It is, and a lot of it is frankly playing catch up. You know, we hear from, I mean, lost in this conversation, it was, my kids were in school at the time, so 12 years ago or so, we had a significant cut to our education budget that resulted in my school district laying off 25% of its workforce. And so when you compare where we're at now, we just only the last 2 years have gotten back to the point of where we are. Meanwhile, our student population has grown. And so, it's you know, perhaps different than a lot of other stories in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Some of this is still playing catch up, but I would genuinely appreciate that.
Absolutely.
If I could wrap up the conversation, this is what I've heard and learned today. I once again, Madam Chair, thank you for joining us and filling in beyond ably for Chair Cutler. I will tell him that when I see him, and I'll let him know that he can take care of other issues anytime he wants to, because he'll do absolutely fine filling in for your caucus. So thank you, ma'am. And to your staff and ours, and to all of our testifiers, thank you again for your flexibility. Here's what I heard. I heard that over the last three years, graduation rates are up, our attendance is up, math scores are up, our career readiness indicators are all moving in a positive direction. We have to be honest and said we have a dip in ELA, English Language Arts. But to Mr. Riggleman, to your point earlier, does the legislature actually look at data? Last year in the budget, we increased programs at the behest of, frankly, one of our colleagues here on this committee, Representative Ortiz, to do more work in the literacy space, directly responding to a question of data and where we're at. In addition to that, I just like to point out, we don't just simply spend money. We made 5 significant changes to our teacher certification package in last year's education code. Only one of them had an economic impact, and that was actually reducing fees to make it easier for folks to come in. This committee and this chamber has passed additional data collection, hasn't gotten the traction that we had hoped for in the Senate, on both facilities and transportation. We'd love our colleagues and friends in the other chamber to join us in this effort to get more data and more information so that we can continue to make the best decisions possible. And we are continuing and constantly looking at policy changes in addition to protecting what we've already done and started and frankly agreed to with the litigants, perhaps unofficially. It wasn't a court finding, but you haven't resued us on the adequacy. Cool, thank you. But that so long as we continue to protect this work, we can protect the funding streams that we've again largely agreed to. We have additional work to do in the policy space, and so we're always interested and open to new conversations about those things. With that said, a reminder to my colleagues on the hardest working committee in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that we have a very long, lengthy voting meeting. It could have been longer. Ask Kate, she'll tell you. At 10 a.m. on Wednesday in room B31, we are going to do the longest, one of the longer voting meetings in one of the most uncomfortable rooms in this chamber, so you're welcome. And with that, we'll see everybody Wednesday. Thank you all.